Hello everyone, my name is Matt Claythermos, and I'd like to welcome you to our TIERS overview. TIERS stands for Trauma-Informed Experiential Reasoning Skills, and it was something that was developed as a part of Project Forecast. So as a little background, Project Forecast was developed really to it was designed to help support the creation and development of a trauma-informed workforce, particularly in relationship to child welfare, child protection, any sorts of child-serving professionals. And so TIERS was really something that we developed to help support that process. So TIERS really came from a synthesis of themes related to trauma competencies that were present in as many different systems or disciplines as we could think of that would be applicable. So that can include child welfare, mental health, law enforcement, you name it. And so looking at these bullet points, the core concepts, which you've already had some exposure to, are what we want forecast students and trainees to know. TIERS, on the other hand, are really much more focused on action. This is what we want students and trainees to do. So this slide will give you a big picture view of the overarching structure and the four levels, different levels of TIERS. So when we break this down, you'll see that we have our first tier is the professional level, which goes into professional conduct, knowledge, and methodology. Our next tier looks at the consumer level, which is more about engagement, screening, and intervention. Tier number 3 looks at the team level, which is about collaboration and communication. And finally, the last tier looks at the community level, which is really much more focused on prevention and advocacy. So what I would encourage is as we go through the rest of this overview, after the different sections, we're going to have this broken down where there is a definition of each of these particular tiers. And so what I would encourage is as we get through those, read through the definition. And on the following slides, we're going to give examples of what those different tiers look like in action in the story that we're going to be presenting. Okay, now we're going to get into the heart of this overview of TIERS. And to really try to bring the TIERS to life, we've decided to apply them to a story that's well known to all of us, the story of Cinderella. So for the remainder of this training, you're going to hear a slightly updated or altered version of the Cinderella story, really designed to help illustrate how TIERS might look in action. So what's going to happen over the upcoming slides is you'll have 2 to 3 slides that involve hearing chunks of the story of Cinderella as we've reimagined it. Following each of those bits of the story, we're going to take a break and look at the specific tiers that are most applicable to that section and give examples of what those tiers looked like in the course of the Cinderella story. And then throughout the rest of the training, we'll continue to do that process of hearing chunks of the Cinderella story and then going back into more discussion of examples of tiers that were present. So hopefully this will be a fun, entertaining way for you to start to apply and be able to think about the actual actions that the different tiers are describing. So I hope you enjoy, and we'll let Cinderella take it from here.
The prince was having a grand time at the royal ball. He met a beautiful girl about his age with whom he had danced much of the night. He first realized something was strange when he asked for her name, and she dropped her eyes nervously and said nothing. He was about to ask again, thinking she may have misunderstood him. However, before he could ask, she suddenly looked at the clock, which was fast approaching midnight. Seeing the time, the girl appeared to become even more agitated. The prince grew concerned and asked what was wrong. She muttered fretfully, "I must leave and go home, or I will be in terrible trouble." She broke free from him and ran frantically down the grand staircase, leaving behind a glass slipper in her haste. The next morning, the prince was attending a school for future aristocracy led by the kingdom's royal tutor. The tutor noted that the prince seemed distracted, despondent, and was at times solemnly studying what appeared to be a glass slipper. Sensing something was amiss with his young charge, the tutor went over to the prince during a break between lessons and asked if something was wrong. The prince, who had known the tutor much of his life, told him about the previous evening and his concern for the mysterious girl. He noted that he was greatly worried about the girl's well being, given the intense fright that she displayed. The wise old tutor was concerned. Having known the prince for so long, he knew that he was a perceptive lad and likely accurate about the girl's distress. Given that the prince and his guests were teenagers, the tutor suspected that she might be the victim of child abuse. The prince's father, the king, had recently decreed that all suspicions of child abuse should be reported to the royal council for investigation. The tutor wrote a note containing the details of his concern, sealed the scroll with wax, and attached it to the child abuse and neglect messenger pigeon for delivery. Within a few minutes, the pigeon keeper for the royal council received the message and forwarded it to one of the realm's highly trained investigators. The investigator followed up with the tutor due to concerns about being able to locate this mysterious girl. The tutor noted that he had further studied the glass slipper left by the girl and noted it appeared to be unusually small for a teenage girl, likely only fitting 1 in a million. The investigator, realizing that this glass slipper might be the only avenue for identifying the girl, contacted the royal guard, who went to obtain the slipper from the prince to aid the investigation. Upon returning with the slipper, the royal guardsmen met with the investigator to discuss their next steps. They decided that they would take the slipper from home to home in the kingdom, asking all teenage girls to try on the slipper, in hopes that they could identify the girl in this manner. During a witness interview with the prince, they were able to determine the direction that the girl fled from the castle and identify the most likely neighborhoods that she could live in. Though still a daunting task, they realized that canvassing these communities might be their only chance to identify this girl who seemed so obviously in need of help.
So, based on Dorothy's lovely, very passionate reading of our revised Cinderella story, we're going to start talking a little bit about how the various tiers can apply to this story that we just heard. So, we're going to start with tier one, and then we're going to move through each of those tiers, and we're going to talk about them in more detail on the upcoming slides. So, thinking about tier one, professional conduct. We mentioned these behavioral anchors previously, but we have things like respond ethically, integrate feedback, managing biases, addressing secondary traumatic stress. And thinking about how we saw some of these anchors maybe come into play during our Cinderella story, we can argue pretty reasonably that the tutor made a very ethically sound response to the situation by recognizing the prince's concern, having his own concern for the well being of this mysterious girl, and then making a mandated report as would be ethically required and legally required by his profession.
Next tiers in the professional domain is knowledge. And we think it's really important that professionals demonstrate understanding and application of kind of this broad knowledge base about traumatic stress. It doesn't mean anything if we know everything in the world about trauma but don't know how to apply that knowledge in service of the people that we care so much about.
So we have the tier two trauma knowledge behavioral anchors, which are largely focused on the ability to reduce the impact of trauma, having knowledge about consumer experiences, and being able to address consumers' issues related to signs and symptoms of traumatic stress, risk and protective and promotive factors, family and caregiving dynamics, to understand and to recognize potential trauma reactions when we see them, and also to reduce the impact of secondary adversities on consumers. So, in this particular section of our Cinderella story, we do see knowledge being applied, like I mentioned earlier. So, both the prince and the tutor recognized that there was something going on with the behavior of this mysterious girl that was concerning. They recognized that there may be some possible indicators in her behavior that she was under significant distress, perhaps in danger, and maybe even possibly indicative of trauma exposure or exposure to child abuse and neglect. So now let's consider how Tier 3 or trauma informed methodology impacts our story of Cinderella. So, thinking about our behavioral anchors for this tier, we have the ability to apply critical thinking, to be able to respond to abuse disclosures effectively, to execute mandated reporting, to be able to compile evidence, and to implement trauma informed investigation plans. So, the ability to engage in methodology in these different areas. And we also do see this in our story of Cinderella. So, thinking through, we have the tutor. So, the tutor had to effectively execute mandated reporting by sending that passenger pigeon to the royal court. And he did so effectively and sort of instigated that whole investigation process. Following the effective execution of the mandated reporting, we have the investigator come into play, and who starts in this section to engage in a lot of different forms of methodology, including being able to start compiling evidence by interviewing the tutor and the prince, identifying and collecting the glass slipper as a really important piece of evidence moving forward, and also began to implement a trauma informed investigation plan. So the investigator and the royal guard developed a plan for going through the kingdom and using that glass slipper to try to identify the family that was of concern in this situation.
In each of the likely communities, the guardsmen and the investigator spoke to various residents who had significant contact with children in the community. At each identified house containing a teenage girl, they interviewed all family members and asked that any teenage girls try on the glass slipper. After many unsuccessful attempts, they received a tip that led them to a likely home. A local clergyman informed them of the Tremaine family. The clergyman indicated that Mr. Tremaine had remarried but subsequently died, leaving his biological daughter to live with her stepmother and stepsisters. Many people in the neighborhood had noticed that the biological daughter, Cinderella, appeared to be dirty, malnourished, and poorly dressed in comparison to her stepsisters. There were also concerns of physical and emotional abuse, as Cinderella often cringed when around her stepmother, and the stepmother and stepsisters had been seen cruelly taunting and ridiculing Cinderella. Upon arriving at the Tremaine home, the investigator identified herself and asked if she could speak to Mrs. Tremaine and any children in the home. Mrs. Tremaine was reluctant, but ultimately allowed the investigator and guardsmen to enter the home. The investigator informed Mrs. Tremaine of her concern for the unknown girl at the royal ball and the subsequent concerns that had arisen regarding her stepdaughter, Cinderella. Mrs. Tremaine became defensive and harshly insisted that there were no concerns in her home. The investigator maintained a calm demeanor and began to ask Mrs. Tremaine about how things had been going in general. She noted that it must be a difficult time for Mrs. Tremaine, given that she had recently lost her husband and was left to do her best caring for three teenage daughters. Mrs. Tremaine relaxed a bit and acknowledged that things have been very difficult recently. However, she stressed that things would be fine except for having to deal with Cinderella. She noted that Cinderella is constantly messing things up and can't do anything right. She suggested that Cinderella's father spoiled her relentlessly and turned her into a lazy, useless brat. Mrs. Tremaine complained that Cinderella had even had the nerve to beg her to go to the recent royal ball, even though she had not completed her chores for the day. Mrs. Tremaine indicated she had left Cinderella at the home while she and her daughters went to the ball. The investigator validated Miss Tremaine's struggles and asked to speak with Cinderella. The investigator met with Cinderella in the kitchen while the royal guardsman waited with Miss Tremaine and her daughters in the living room. The investigator initially engaged in a rapport building with Cinderella, asking about her interests and hobbies. Cinderella gradually warmed up and began talking about her love of animals. While doing so, Cinderella described an excessive amount of chores that she had to complete around the home each day. She claimed that she would never be able to complete those chores without the help of her animal friends. She also noted that these animal friends kept her company when she was locked in her room by her stepmother, sometimes for days at a time. The investigator then conducted a safety screen with Cinderella and quickly recognized that she was not being provided with sufficient food and clothing and was not being allowed adequate social interaction, suggesting that she was not safe in her current placement. The investigator then asked about things that helped Cinderella feel safe. Cinderella lit up at that question and immediately mentioned her godmother, Miss Fairy. She noted that Miss Fairy was a friend of her deceased father and had been looking out for Cinderella as long as she could remember. Cinderella stated that Miss Fairy did not have much money, but was able to provide Cinderella with food and clothing when she most needed it, almost like magic. The investigator asked when Miss Fairy had last helped Cinderella. Cinderella said Miss Fairy had recently given her a dress and some shoes, but that she had lost one of the shoes. Moving slowly, the investigator pulled out the glass slipper and asked, "Might this be the shoe you lost?" Cinderella's face went red. Her eyes dropped to the floor, and she began to shake. The investigator reassured Cinderella that she was there to keep her safe, and then asked her to try on the glass slipper. Cinderella grew pale, but agreed to try on the slipper, which was a perfect fit. Cinderella looked up and said, "Please don't tell stepmother I was at the ball. If she knows, she'll give me a whooping again." Recognizing Cinderella's rising distress and knowing that she had obtained enough information to move forward with the investigator decided to discontinue questioning and refer Cinderella for a forensic interview. The investigator then completed a review of the home. She noted that Cinderella's room was largely barren, had a blanket on the floor rather than a bed, had only one tattered dress in the closet, and had a broken window that left the room cold and damp. She also noticed that on the outside of the door to Cinderella's room there was a lock that could be used to keep someone inside. In contrast, the rooms of Mrs. Tremaine's daughters were bright, warm, amply furnished, and filled with sufficient clothing and goods. Based on this information, the investigator concluded the visit by developing a safety plan. It was determined that Cinderella would be temporarily placed with Ms. Fairy pending a home visit, at least until the completion of the investigation. Mrs. Tremaine agreed that she would not have unsupervised contact with Cinderella at this time.
Okay, now we have tier 4, consumer engagement. And there was actually quite a bit of engagement that had to happen during this section of Cinderella's story. And so, thinking of our behavioral anchors here, we have the ability to empathically respond to consumers, to utilize best practices regarding engagement, to be able to show appropriate affect in our interactions with consumers, utilize active listening skills, think about trauma informed and utilize trauma informed transition strategies. And then also considering and analyzing cultural factors that are involved in the situation. So in our Cinderella story here that we have this investigator in a pretty difficult situation, having to engage with the stepmother who is, you know, assumedly engaging in some fairly significant child abuse and neglect regarding Cinderella. And this investigator effectively validates the challenges that she has dealt with, particularly since the death of her husband, engaged in a lot of active listening, both with the stepmother and with Cinderella. and throughout managed to maintain appropriate affect by keeping a calm demeanor and staying responsive and warm and calm in a relatively difficult circumstance with a potentially pretty distressed child and a pretty defensive caregiver. Moving on to tier 5, screening and assessment. So really now we're getting into behavioral anchors that are focused on using strength based language when we're talking to consumers, being able to take the information, gather it, and synthesize it, educate consumers and MDT members about child abuse and neglect, the impact of it, being able to conduct a trauma informed, developmentally appropriate interview with consumers of a variety of ages, and then finally to assess safety and risk. Our investigator in our Cinderella story also engaged in these tiers in a variety of ways. We saw them or heard them conduct a safety screen to really try to understand to what degree Cinderella was safe in her current placement, what were the risk factors present for her, and then also, to accomplish that, the investigator conducted developmentally appropriate interviews with both the stepmother and Cinderella and gathered a lot of information that could help her make a determination regarding the safety and risk that was present in the current situation, as well as, leading into possible intervention strategies, which we'll talk about next. Tier number 6. Now that our investigator has engaged with the family and has gathered information through screening and assessment, it's time for them to intervene. And so, thinking about the types of interventions that we saw our investigator make for Cinderella's family, we first off saw that they developed a safety plan with both the stepmother and Cinderella, designed to think about how are we going to protect Cinderella moving forward, with that safety plan formulating around this idea of placing Cinderella with her godmother, Miss Fairy, who she has a positive relationship with. And similarly, looking again at our behavioral anchors here, that was also done in a way to facilitate a less distressing transition. So the placement with the godmother was an ideal one for Cinderella, given that she already had pretty significant contact with her, had a positive relationship with her, and viewed her as a caregiver already. So all of that's likely going to minimize the distress or the disruption related to that placement change.
Following the visit at the Tremaine home, the investigators scheduled a meeting with the Royal Council to discuss the next steps for the investigation process. Cinderella was referred for a forensic interview, during which she disclosed even more episodes of neglect and abuse. The appropriate members of the Royal Council were present to watch the interview, ensuring that Cinderella would not be re traumatized by having to complete multiple interviews. The royal physician recommended that Cinderella receive a medical examination to determine if there were any physical indications of abuse and to address any lingering effects of malnourishment. Based on Cinderella's apparent hallucinations about talking animals, it was decided that she would benefit from a psychological evaluation to understand how she's been impacted by her abusive experience and to assess for any underlying mental health conditions. The council also received an update regarding Cinderella's placement with Miss Fairy. It was noted that Cinderella appeared to be thriving, having already gained a few pounds. Cinderella reported feeling safe with Miss Fairy, who confirmed that Cinderella was welcome to stay with her permanently. The investigator indicated that she planned to make a recommendation to the royal court to initiate the process of granting legal guardianship of Cinderella to Miss Fairy.
Okay, now that our investigator has completed that initial home visit with Cinderella's family, now they're bringing that back to the rest of the multidisciplinary team. And so we're really getting heavily into Tier 7, our system collaboration. So, thinking about our behavioral anchors here, the team members need to interact respectively, be able to communicate with each other and with consumers about child protection processes, explaining court actions. They need to follow the necessary procedures that each discipline needs to abide by. They need to really be able to work together to make good, sound, trauma informed collaborative decisions. They're going to continue to support trauma informed engagement with the family and maybe consider recommending changes in policies if they're seeing things that could be improved upon. So, going back to our Cinderella story, we start to see here in this section that the investigator is taking information back to the rest of the team, and they worked collaboratively to make some decisions on how to move forward with supporting Cinderella and her family as a whole. We see that start off with the forensic interview process. And they demonstrated the ability to follow that forensic interview protocol. We had the necessary members of the investigation team present for that, making it so Cinderella would not have to repeat that process. And so they did a really nice job of following those basic investigation protocols and beginning to engage with each other and share information collaboratively. All right, with Tier 8, we're focusing on professional communication. So, behavioral anchors include things like composing factual, clear reports or making factual, clear verbal statements as necessary, and really focusing on the ability to recommend relevant actions. And during our Cinderella story, we see quite a bit of this start to occur. So, we see them communicating with each other respectfully and clearly. They're providing clear information to each other about what's needed for the family, and they're starting to make recommendations regarding relevant actions. So, including things like the medical member of the MDT suggesting that a medical exam would be helpful to make sure that Cinderella is physically healthy following these experiences. The mental health provider is recommending a psychological evaluation given concerns about Cinderella's interesting relationship with animals. And then finally, the child protection worker investigator is recommending that there may need to be some considerations around guardianship being made and a request being made to court to consider guardianship being granted to Miss Fairy, the godmother. So we do see a lot of this professional communication happening, both informally and possibly a little bit more formally, if the investigator were to write a report to the royal court regarding those guardianship recommendations.
Child serving professionals and other passionate community members helped support mounting advocacy efforts to reduce child neglect. They developed a kingdom wide free education program for children and youth who could not attend the school for royal aristocracy, with annual education efforts focused on trauma prevention. They initiated a grief support and mentorship program for children after the loss of a parent. They developed parenting support groups for parents who had a child who experienced trauma. They also expanded training for child abuse reporters and invested in a larger fleet of carrier pigeons to ensure timely investigations should abuse occur. And they all lived happily ever after.
Okay, with our remaining two tiers, we start to see the picture broaden a little bit and move just move beyond just Cinderella's personal experience and looking more broadly at what's going on for children in the kingdom that might be experiencing child abuse and neglect. So, for example, tier number 9 focuses on this idea of prevention. And so our behavioral anchors include things like integrating trauma informed prevention programs and interventions, and also then implementing those prevention programs. So, in our Cinderella story, we do see some prevention efforts begin to be made. So, we see changes related to the development of a free education program, particularly with a focus on education that would hopefully result in trauma prevention. We see the creation of grief support groups for youth who have lost a parent, and then also parent support groups for caregivers who might have children who have experienced trauma. All of these things can potentially help prevent, both possibly the occurrence of further trauma, but also can help prevent the development of significant, long lasting emotional or behavioral problems associated with exposure to trauma. And finally, we have tier 10, which focuses on advocacy. So, our behavioral anchors are thinking about things like creating awareness in our community regarding child abuse and neglect, collaborating to advocate for the necessary resources to both prevent further child abuse and neglect, but also to support children who have already experienced that. And then finally, to advocate for necessary policy changes that might help further this prevention or protection of children. So, in our story here with Cinderella, we do see some efforts beginning to be made around advocacy. So, they push for expanded training for reporters. And this would ideally focus on enhancing the reporters' awareness of child abuse and neglect, both the frequency of it, indicators of child abuse and neglect, to further their ability to recognize and make reports to protect children. We also see that there's a push for advocacy for resources, both to better fund the messenger pigeon system for reporting child abuse and neglect occurrences in the kingdom, but also resources to help ensure that timely investigations are happening, that the investigators have sufficient resources to meet all the needs of the children in the kingdom in a timely manner.